Hey there, campers. Curry coming back at you with some more Pokemon TCG content. This video is actually not going to have any gameplay in it because today I just kind of want to go over a deck and then follow up with some gameplay in a future video. And the deck that I'm looking to highlight is the kind of new kid on the block for the Temporal Forces set in the Roaring Moon Dunsparce deck. This deck's seen a little bit of success both at EUIC as well as the recent Orlando regional event, and it's actually also the deck that I chose to take that event with a little bit of a twist on it that I'll get to a little bit later in this video. And I'm actually planning to go over a little bit of a tournament recap for that event for myself as well. So, without further ado, let's get on with it. And as I said here, I present to you the evolution of Roaring Moon. So first list that we're going to look at is the list piloted by Mark Hostrup. Apologies if I butcher that name. I actually have no idea how to pronounce that O. But this list was piloted by Mark all the way to a top 8 finish at EUIC and features 4 of the brand new Baby Roaring Moon from the Temporal Forces set with the Vengeance Fletching attack that does 70 plus 10 more for each ancient card in the discard pile. You may have seen in the previous video where DBN and I played an ancient and future kind of face-off that this Roaring Moon is very effective at dealing with low HP targets and things that have dark weakness. It was complemented still by the powerful Roaring Moon EX from the Paradox Rift expansion that is still able to just knock out any card in a single hit as soon as it hits the field, with its Frenzied Gouging attack that only has the requirement that you put 200 damage on Roaring Moon when you utilize that attack. And the other kind of new interesting tool that this deck got was the Dunsparce. And actually, it's kind of important to highlight the Dunsparce too. So when we look at this Dunsparce, we can see it's got 0 retreat. And this is very important in this deck where having access to be able to dark patch your attackers whenever you need to is kind of more important than you may initially realize that it could be. And then the Dunsparce itself also functions as a draw support system with its runaway draw ability, which allows you to draw 3 cards and then shuffle the Dunsparce and any attached cards back into your deck. So not only does this give you access to some kind of resistance to disruption effects like Roxanne and Iono, it also, in some instances, can serve as a means of preventing yourself from decking out as you try to just churn through your deck to pitch these ancient cards to your discard pile. And you can see we've got a nice suite of ancient cards here with 4 copies of the Small Roaring Moon. Mark chose to play 3 copies of the EX. We have 4 copies both of Professor Sada's Vitality, which serves as draw, energy acceleration, and has that ancient tag, so it's kind of like the all-inclusive package as far as being a premier ancient card. Explorer's Guidance is a new ancient supporter from this set. It's a little bit weaker. It's something that I believe is only in this deck because it has that ancient tag. If there was a different ancient supporter that was at all utilizable, it would probably replace Guidance in a heartbeat. We follow this up. We still have Boss's Orders. Penny is an interesting inclusion here. It serves a few different functions in that in some of your single prize mirror matches or just other ancient box decks, you may have single prize attackers swinging into each other but not necessarily reaching full one-hit KOs. And that's where Penny can come in to scoop up that single prize attacker, put it back into your hand, reset all of that damage off the field. The other function is for keeping your Radiant Greninja out of trouble in matchups like Snorlax Stall, where they will seek to pull your Greninja up to your active and just prevent it from retreating. Moving forward, we've got 4 copies of Earthen Vessel, very powerful item card, is an ancient card, allows you to discard another card with it, and lets you search your deck for 2 energy, which we can then combo with Radiant Greninja with concealed cards, get those energies back with either Professor Sada's Vitality or Dark Patch, and you can kind of see how all of the cards in this deck really just work together synergistically to kind of just give you a big boost of power very quickly. We've got 4 Nest Balls for search, 2 Ultra Balls that serve as search and discard. Artisan is the stadium of choice to fuel both the Calamity Storm attack from Roaring Moon, allowing you to knock out most basic EXs and I believe all or very nearly all basic V Pokemon. And then we have 4 Ancient Booster Energy Capsules, to boost the damage of our Baby Roaring Moon, as well as giving our attackers access to more HP, making them more difficult to knock out. We've got 3 different gust effects: Encounter Catcher, Boss's Orders, and Prime Catcher. A little bit of recycling for our Pokemon and energy with Super Rod. And then the last thing here that I kind of want to highlight in this list, and you'll see in the next list that I'm going to talk about as well, is the trekking shoes, which I would say going into Orlando, I was a bit of a hater on this card in this deck, in that I felt that it served very little purpose, very little function, and it was just kind of a filler card that people didn't necessarily know what to do with those last few slots. There's a few cute things you can do with this, namely in that if you knowingly shuffle an Ancient Booster Energy Capsule back into your deck with the Dunsparce, when you have a low deck size, you can potentially Trekking Shoes to fuel an Ancient card to your discard pile. Early game, it does a bit of draw smoothing and just kind of making your hands a little bit cleaner than they otherwise would be. And it's just kind of a minor consistency tool that won't often bail you out of a bad hand, but it is very good at making a good hand even better, as well as being something that allows you to dig a little bit deeper in your deck after you have used your supporter for turn. So then following on this, we have the list just from this past weekend that Cyrus McCain took to a top 8 finish at Orlando Regionals. And you can see I've highlighted the changes between Mark and Cyrus's list here on the screen, with Cyrus playing 1 fewer copy of the Roaring Moon EX and compensating for that by playing an additional Super Rod. Cyrus also chose to cut a copy of Artisan to play a copy of Temple of Sinnoh. And the only thing I can think for this is that it is just a nod of respect towards Mist Energy to try to bolster both your Lugia matchup as well as potentially any Charizard list that might choose to include it after the initial showing of this deck at EUIC. Because prior to EUIC, I feel like this deck was relatively under the radar. It had had some minor online tournament success, but people weren't really talking about it. And then you could see just the development of this deck between EUIC to Orlando Regionals, where people just, every podcast was covering it. Multiple other YouTubers have already covered this deck, so I'm hoping that I'm doing a little bit of justice and providing some new information to people if they were looking for it. But other than that, you can see all the counts in this deck are exactly the same between Mark and Cyrus's list, aside from those couple of small minor changes. And then I wanted to highlight what I played at the event this weekend. So you can see right here in the bottom left corner, played 0 copies of Trekking Shoes. Like I said, I was a bit of a hater on this card. I chose to instead play Pokegear, and then took that additional slot to add a Professor's Research. And the rationale behind this was that I wanted to be able to hopefully get myself out of bricked hands a bit better than what Trekking Shoes is capable of allowing you to do, while also giving myself access to a card that could potentially just funnel a whole lot of Ancient cards to this card pile in a single turn, which is something that's harder to do. There were a few other things that we experimented with in the lead up to this event, such as a 4th copy of Dunsparce, a 3rd Ultra Ball, and then I kind of stumbled on the idea of playing Iron Leaves in this deck. And that's where I chose to cut an EX, and I imagine Cyrus actually did this for the same reason. Roaring Moon EX is not a very good starter. Iron Leaves, admittedly, is also not a very good starter, but it's something that only has 1 retreat, so it's a lot easier to move from the active if you have access to attacking with a small Roaring Moon. Iron Leaves also does give you the ability to one-hit KO a Charizard EX that has a Mist Energy attached, which is something that you can't otherwise do, and it's actually very easy to power up. As long as you have 2 Ancient Pokemon on your field, you can use a Professor Sada's Vitality to attach a Grass and Dark or 2 Grass from your discard pile to your Ancient Pokemon. You play your Iron Leaves, use its Rapid Vernier ability to move it to the active. It siphons all of that energy to itself. You attach whatever energy you're missing, and you attack. And you can do some nice recycling of this attack, assuming your Iron Leaves doesn't get knocked out, by retreating it for 1 energy, promoting it to Dunsparce, using the Runaway Draw ability, which allows you to then re-promote Iron Leaves, which resets the negative effect of that Prism Edge attack, and you could just attack again by attaching another energy. The only other change that I had to make to fit all of this in was cutting a Stadium, which in hindsight was probably a very bad thing to do. One of the things that I've learned playing this deck, especially after playing it this weekend, is that it is a very, very Dunsparce-focused deck, and Dunsparce is really what makes your deck run. And so you need to make sure you have access to Dunsparce and to Dunsparce at all times, just in case you need it. So we'll be looking at moving forward, probably making sure that that count stays at 3. I'm curious to see whether or not Cyrus noticed anything similar by having a lower count of Artisan in his list. So then as far as the matchups go for this weekend, this is the first regional that I've attended since, or first major event that I've attended since U.S. Nationals 2013. So I was kind of nervous coming back into things, but also excited to do so. So we opened up the day with a mirror, of all things. It's something I was a little disappointed to see, knowing that just a week prior, the deck would have been low enough on the radar that it would have been very unlikely that this would have occurred. And this is not a very exciting mirror. If you're able to early game put together a small Roaring Moon with an Ancient Booster Capsule to prevent your opponent from taking a one-hit knockout while you're able to take a one-hit knockout, you're likely to win the game. If you're able to put together a Roaring Moon EX with an Ancient Booster Capsule and knock out that Ancient Booster Capsule small Roaring Moon that your opponent has presented, you are likely to win the game because then they are forced to Frenzied Gouging. One of the things that my list had a small advantage on compared to most other lists was that I could answer that big Roaring Moon EX with an Ancient Booster Capsule without having to use Frenzied Gouging thanks to the Iron Leaves. This didn't come up in this matchup. Unfortunately, my opponent drew very poorly in the first game, and I just kind of ran him off the board very quickly. And in the second game, I was able to limit his draw by knocking out Dunsparce for my first 3 prizes, so he had no access to draw and was not fueling his ancient card count in his discard pile as the game kind of opened up. In the second round, I faced a Goldengo deck, and rather than playing Palkia V-Star as a supporting card, my opponent chose to play Scizor from Obsidian Flames, and the first game, unfortunately, my opponent opened with just a Minior, and he drew and passed, and I promptly knocked it out. So we moved on to game 2, which was a bit more back and forth. Goldengo still just really struggles to knock out these large HP single prize Pokemon over the course of an entire game, and we can trade relatively 1-to-1 with them during that time, while they're having to throw way more resources at taking these knockouts as far as having to use superior energy retrievals and just digging for more cards. And I was just very comfortably able to chain knockout after knockout after knockout. And the Scizor, unfortunately for my opponent, was not very effective in this matchup. Most of the time I only had one ability on the field in the form of Greninja, because I could choose to just only put the Dunsparce down when I was ready to use it. So that Scizor's damage was never really able to ramp up, and we took another victory, just 2-0. The third round played against a Lost Zone Toolbox deck, which utilized Iron Hands, Iron Leaves, and Mew EX as its primary attackers. I believe there was a Raikou V in there as well. And unfortunately for my opponent, he didn't draw very well game 1. Didn't play a Colress Experiment until turn 3 or 4. And I was just too far ahead at that point for him to come back. Game 2, I made an error on my first turn. My opponent chose to let me go first, and I chose to leave a Roaring Moon active with 2 Dunsparce on my bench with another Roaring Moon in my hand, even though I knew from the first game that my opponent played an Iron Bundle. So he was able to get up to 4 cards on his Lost Zone on his first turn, thanks to some Flower Selectings from Comfey, along with a Colress Experiment, and then find that Iron Bundle, put it down, use its Hyper Blower ability to force me to push my Roaring Moon to the bench and bring a Dunsparce up, and then took a knockout with a Cramorant. Because of that, the game was actually relatively close. I ended up winning by a single prize at the end, where the win would have been much, much more comfortable had I just benched that second Roaring Moon on turn 1. Round 4, played against a Lost Zone Giratina deck, where my opponent had very explosive starts all 3 games, played Colress Experiment on his first supporter-capable turn every single game, and just really got his Lost Zone ramped up very quickly. Game 1 came down to my opponent choosing to Roxanne me, and I needed to be able to find Prime Catcher to win the game by knocking out a Giratina V-Star on the bench, while my opponent had just a 1 prize attacker sitting in the active. And unfortunately, fortunately I should say, I drew Research off of the Roxanne, played Research, drew my 7 cards, and did not see the Prime Catcher. Ended up scooping my cards for game 2 and just went to check my deck to see where the Prime Catcher was, and it was the 8th card. So you win some, you lose some. That's just kind of how it works out. Game two, I kind of ran my opponent off the board. I took a knockout on my first attacking turn by using Prime Catcher to bring up my opponent's only Giratina V on the board and knocked it out with Calamity Storm. The next turn, I bossed up his, again, only Giratina on the board and used Frenzied Gouging to KO it. And at that point, my opponent just hadn't set anything up. He was low on resources. He had actually lost zoned his third Giratina and didn't have a Super Rod at the time, so he chose to scoop. We went to game three, where unfortunately I just drew absolutely dead. I just kind of drew past while my opponent slowly picked apart my board and just took 5 prizes before I decided that I was done with the game. The next round, I played my first Charizard for the day, and in game one, my opponent's start was pretty slow, and he chose to just scoop probably about 3 turns in because I had taken knockouts on my second and third turn, and he still did not have access to a Charizard. Game 2 was a bit more back and forth, where again, I missed just one kind of resource somewhere along the way thanks to a disruption card from my opponent, and unfortunately we didn't get to finish game 3 due to time. Round 6 was another Charizard Pidgeot matchup. This one was a lot tougher because my opponent not only played Mist Energy, but also played Hero's Cape as his ace spec. So my Iron Leaves actually was not able to knock out that caped Charizard when it was active. So I was forced in game 2 to actually 3-hit KO it. Game 1 was actually very similar to game 1 of round 5, where my opponent just couldn't really get set up, and I was able to get a quick prize lead that he was just unable to come back from. And as I said, game 2, at one point it took me 3 turns to take a knockout in the Charizard, and that was just enough of a wedge for my opponent to kind of pull too far ahead for me to come back. And then again, we just couldn't finish game 3 thanks to the current time rules. Round 7 was another loss on Giratina, and this is more or less a repeat of round 4, actually, where game 1, I came just short. Actually, I may be confusing game 1 and game 2 here. I know at one point, I kind of ran my opponent off the board. Another game, I was short by 1 turn, and then in the third game, once again, I drew completely dead. Couldn't do anything. Round 8, I played against my opponent with Charizard Bibarel, and this is actually significantly easier than Charizard Pidgeot, because even though my opponent was not presenting multiple easy knockouts in the forms of 2 prizers on the board, they just consistently, the reason that this archetype doesn't see as much play as Charizard Pidgeot is that Charizard Pidgeot is able to find exactly what it needs every single turn. Whereas Bibarel, you're just hoping that you're able to draw into it thanks to the additional card draw that you have on a given turn. And unfortunately for my opponent, that just didn't happen in 2 of the games that we played. And then in the last round, I played another mirror, and this came down to me just not choosing to scoop game 2 soon enough. I took up an early prize lead in game 1, and my opponent wasn't able to come back. My opponent had more or less done the same to me in game 2, but his board was shaky enough that I thought that there was a chance I could make him miss a knockout on a turn, that I could kind of flip the script on him. This wasn't the case, and I scooped probably about 5 minutes later than I should have, because in game 3, I was just blazing ahead of my opponent in that I drew past going first, didn't even attach an energy. My opponent opened with Roaring Moon EX, attached and passed, and on turn 2, I was able to put together a combination of cards that I actually used Iron Leaves Prism Edge Attack off of a bare board with 1 Pokemon, and just absolutely shocked my opponent. There's no way that he could have been prepared for that. And so he starts digging for resources on his next turn, trying to return this KO. And because it's so early in the game, there's no way he can do it with a small Roaring Moon. He has to use either Calamity Storm or Frenzied Gouging. And he actually ends up whiffing the energy to even be able to attack with the Roaring Moon EX on his bench. So he's got a Roaring Moon EX on his bench with a booster capsule and 2 energies attached, and it's just a sitting duck. I actually took Prime Catcher off my prizes here. So I take another 2 prize knockout on this turn. And just as I take that knockout, time is called. And so for those of you that don't know how the time rules work in Pokemon, when time is called in a round during a tournament, the active player's turn is turn 0, and then each player there are 3 additional turns. So active player is turn 0, Next player would be turn 1, then bounces back to the turn 0 player to be turn 2, and finally the opponent gets to be turn 3. So each player at the time is called gets to complete 2 more turns total. And because of that, I ended up being just 1 turn short of being able to win this game and come out with a slightly better record. I knew by the time that I had taken 2 ties and 2 losses that I was actually out of contention for day 2, unfortunately, just with the size that these events currently are. You need to have a minimum of 19 match points, which are achieved through getting 3 points for a win, 1 point for a tie, and 0 points for a loss. So I started off with a blazing hot start in the day, kind of fumbled it a little bit in the middle, and then by the time I hit round 7 and took the second L, I knew that there was no way that it was coming back. But overall, for a first tournament experience coming back, I thought that this was a lot of fun. I will say this deck is very much so fun to play. I think that any of these 3 lists are honestly viable and are something that you could take either to your local league or could test for a series event if you wished to. As far as changes for what I would look at moving forward, I think Temple of Sinnoh is a potentially great inclusion. If you want a non-stadium answer to Mist Energy, Mawile from Obsidian Flames with its Special Eater ability that allows you to discard a special energy from your opponent's active Pokemon when you put Mawile in play is a great option. If you want to slightly bump up your Ancient count but don't want to have Roaring Moon EX as that option, Fluttermane is a suitable inclusion, and it also seems to function as something that can kind of bolster your loss in matchups slightly. Palpad is a good option, as you can hit some late game scenarios where you may need either a second boss, or you just need another Sada because your Explorer's Guidance discards have been very bad, or you need to funnel a bunch of Ancient cards into your discard pile, so maybe you do need access to another Guidance. I have Thornton on this chart because I think that it's a reasonable swap for Penny. There can be some situations where you could swap a small Roaring Moon for a big one and then just attach an energy and be ready to go rather than having to have a Sada and a Dark Patch or 2 Dark Patches, and it just is fewer cards to kind of put a combo together. It also still serves the same function of Penny as kind of keeping yourself sort of stall proof by getting Greninja off the board. Switch cart for the same reason. Just a way to potentially either let yourself attack on turn 1 when you otherwise wouldn't be able to, or just moving things out of the active when your opponent tries to stall you for time. Iron Bundle is a searchable pseudo gust effect. If your opponent, for instance, has a Mist Energy attached Charizard, or in the Lugia matchup, when they put a Mist Energy attached Lugia in the active, you just don't want that thing there. It's very difficult to knock out. You would rather kind of take a KO where you can. And Iron Bundle also has the other upside of being able to be recycled with Super Rod. As I said before, I think that moving forward, Trekking Shoes actually probably is something that I would include in this deck. And it's something that since the close of the regional event for myself, I've gone back and tried playing my list online with a couple of minor modifications, including putting shoes back in. And there have just been cases where it just feels a little bit smoother than it did otherwise. The key thing being, as I mentioned earlier, being able to play shoes and having a potential additional effect after you've already played a supporter for a turn, which is something that I had kind of underestimated from the card previously. I've seen people here and there include Brute Bonnet in their lists as an additional damage mod, as well as giving you a way to attack into Iron Hands specifically without having to use Frenzied Gouging, which kind of makes that matchup almost an auto win if you can pull it off successfully. And then the last option is either Iono or Roxanne. I think that one of the weaknesses of this deck, being a very up-tempo, high aggression deck, is that you'll put yourself in situations where your opponent just has time to stockpile and search and draw and do whatever they want to, have whatever they need in their hand. I know in both of my losses against Giratina, my opponents were sitting across the table from me with 15 cards in their hand, and there was just nothing I could do about it. I had made the conscious decision prior to the event to actually cut Iono in favor of Research, just so that I could try to make sure that I was doing my thing more than my opponent was doing theirs. And I think that there's potentially an argument to actually cutting a Guidance and playing either 2 Research, 2 Iono, or 1 of each. But yeah, I just wanted to kind of go through this, give you guys an overview of how my event went, and talk about a deck that I've been relatively excited about since playing in this format and playing with this set. I'm going to have a follow-up video to this where I actually do play some with some of these lists, so look forward to that, and I'll see you soon. Thanks.